Welcome to Inscape Quest, where insightful conversations redefine perspectives. I'm your host, Trudi Howley. Join me as together we delve into discussions about relationships, work, and passions. Today, my guest is Annelise Ware, Program Manager for We Ride Together based in Denver, Colorado. We Ride Together is a non-profit organization created with a mission to make youth and amateur sport environments safer for all athletes. Annelise recognizes the importance of safeguarding all sporting environments, and today we discuss the need for educational awareness on concussions. Welcome, Annelise. I'm really grateful to have you here today. I think we have an important topic to discuss. I know that you work in the capacity as program manager at an organization called We Ride Together, and I'm wondering if you might highlight with the listeners what this organization does.
So We Ride Together is a nonprofit dedicated to ending sexual abuse in sports. We really focus on providing education, awareness, and survivor support to athletes at all levels in all sports.
And you've written some amazing articles on a variety of topics. And one of those topics is about concussions. And I, as a lifelong equestrian, have had multiple concussions and head injuries. And what was your particular interest in addressing this topic?
I came from a psychology background. That's what I studied in undergrad. And then for grad school, I got my degree in mental health services. So we talked a lot about how we should be maintaining our brain health. And especially within athletics, concussions are a major talking point. Ever since the findings about the NFL and CTE, concussions have become an emerging issue within sports. And I personally thought it was interesting, and I wanted to talk about it because these traditionally high-risk sports for concussion that we consider like football and combat sports and even things like soccer, they get a lot of attention. But in different sports, especially sports where there's predominantly female participation, a lot of the time that concussion risk goes unnoticed and is underrepresented in the broader context of the research. So I just wanted to speak on it because first off, I thought it was interesting. And then I just thought about how important a resource like that could have been for me when I was doing ballet.
And you've raised a lot of important points already. And I'm wondering, maybe I could just share a definition of concussion. It's defined as a traumatically induced transient disturbance of brain function. And it also involves a complex pathophysiological process. Concussion is a subset of mild traumatic brain injury, which is generally self-limited and at the less severe end of the brain injury spectrum. And that's a definition from the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine. Hopefully for this conversation, we could use the word concussions and head injuries or mild traumatic brain injury all interchangeably. But I think it would be helpful also to define what some of the symptoms of concussion might be.
Yes. So concussion, there's a lot of misconceptions and misinformation surrounding concussion signs and symptoms. For example, it is often thought that concussions always result in loss of consciousness, which is not true. Some signs and symptoms of concussion we see frequently are memory loss, headaches, confusion. Oftentimes there's sensory disturbances as well. You might be like overly sensitive to light or sound. There's also other signs, motor signs we can look out for, confused appearance, clumsy movements, and also reflexive head shaking can be signs of concussion. It's just important we keep an eye on these signs, especially because we know concussions, they are mild traumatic brain injuries, but there is no minor concussion, if that makes sense.
Yes, and I know I've also experienced sensations of nausea and vomiting as well. And of course, it's different in everybody. You mentioned something about the research that lacks addressing women, and particularly in equestrian sports, there's a high level of women participating across all age ranges. And I'm curious what your thoughts are around how do we navigate that going forward?
I think that there is information out there. It is just few and far in between. We know that progesterone, which is a hormone that fluctuates with the menstrual cycle, is also neuroprotective. Concussion symptoms might be worse when progesterone is low. So I think we can provide athletes with education on menstruation, and we can provide the signs and symptoms of what to look out for. We know also that on average, women take twice as long to recover from concussions as men. So we can consider that when formulating our return to play policies. Unfortunately, there's a major dearth of research on this issue. In fact, 40% of research on sport-related concussions had 0 female participants. And 80% of the research is entirely male-focused. So while the research may be few and far in between, and especially with the administration having these hindrances on certain types of research, I think there's things we can do on the ground level, even small steps we can take to protect our athletes.
And knowing that athletes start at an early age, and there's also a concern about accumulation of head injuries throughout the lifespan, I'm wondering, what's your focus around educating younger athletes, particularly in equestrian sports? Younger athletes tend to fall off more until you gain more experience, or you're riding a wider range of horses that might not be so well trained, and there seems to be a higher propensity of falls in youth aspects of equestrian sports. Do you have thoughts about how to address the different age ranges when it comes to concussion education?
Sure. We teach kids who are very young to wash their hands, how to do things like stop, drop, and roll. We can just as easily educate them that it is important when you get on the horse to wear a helmet, and even things with sizing, right? And the different elements that go into helmets. Even if we're teaching, the parents can then scaffold that to their kids, and all adults in the sporting environment can learn as well. I think it's important we educate athletes young. I don't know what the average age for specialization in equestrian is, but I started doing ballet when I was 2 years old. And you're expected to have lock on a professional track by the time you're hitting like puberty. So I recognize the importance teaching injury prevention even to the youngest groups.
I know with horses and riders, it can be really difficult sometimes to persuade people to not ride. There's a whole host of problems that comes along with stable management or horse exercise if the rider cannot ride. So I'm wondering, in terms of a collective community, how can we support each other not going back to our sport or any sport too soon?
I think it's important that we prioritize athletes having long, sustainable careers, and that we promote sustainable sport. If we prioritize the overall well-being of athletes and we present it from that lens, as opposed to just being like, you can't ride because you got hurt. If the importance of taking the time off was appropriately stressed, I think that could really do well. Because if you're, like you were saying earlier, if you're accumulating head injuries, that causes a lot of damage over time. And it's unfortunate with the kind of lack of female-focused research that we don't really know in some of these sports what the CTE and long-term kind of effects of repeated injuries are, specific more to like female athletes. But I just think it's important. That's what we prioritize. And that's what We Ride Together is all about. We know that when athletes are in a positive environment, surrounded by adults that are working with the athlete's best interests in mind, everyone benefits. Performance improves, team dynamics improve, and athletes are motivated to continue doing the sport into the future. But unfortunately, the vice versa is also the same. Traumatic and harmful environments can drive people away from the sport. And that's not what we want. We want everybody to enjoy equestrian or their sport of choice for as long as they can.
And you and I both have an interest in mental health. And oftentimes I know people who've had falls might have pre-injury existing conditions, like maybe a mood disorder or problems with migraine headaches. And those kind of things can complicate concussion management if it's not a team approach. I think educating governing bodies and the general public, as you're doing, is so important. I'm wondering, what else in terms of resources do you think injured athletes might need access to?
So some resources that I would recommend, if you're looking for sport-specific concussion resources, the Concussion Legacy Foundation is a for athletes, by athletes resource hub for people who are directly dealing with concussions, but also post-concussion syndrome and possible CTE. They're a really excellent resource for people perhaps wanting to cope with some of the mental health symptoms of concussions or pre-existing conditions. Psychology Today is a great resource to connect with therapists near you. You can also, if you're in crisis, you could call the Crisis Lifeline 988, or you could call, for more athlete-focused resources, you could call the Courage First Athlete Helpline at 1-888-279-1026. They're an excellent resource. My coworker, Madison, says the only 3 numbers she knows are her mom, her dad, and the Courage First Athlete Helpline. And that's really true. They're a great resource. And I also just think it's important that we consider maybe why some of these mental health symptoms are so prevalent in certain athletes as well. We want to be proactively preventing, especially because we know a lot of the times women will report more severe mental health symptoms after a concussion than men do. So I think it's important we look inwards. For example, it's hard to keep athletes out of the barn, and that might be truly for love of the game, right? But sometimes there's a lot of drive, especially in higher levels, to constantly be going, constantly be doing the sport. You have to get up and try again every single time. And sometimes that's pushing past athletes' safe limits. So if we can encourage our athletes proactively take care of themselves, here's how you can advocate for yourself if you think a situation is an uncomfortable one. I think that's really important to do as well. And that, again, helps with injury prevention and it helps with abuse prevention.
And it truly does take a village as well. I think, particularly in the barn, oftentimes other people in the barn, they can come together and say, hey, you shouldn't be riding now. And of course, we're all taught from an early age that the most important thing to do after a fall is to get back on. But in the case of a suspected head injury, that's obviously not helpful. So finding a balance between who the people are in your immediate environment who can be educated around this, and of course the governing bodies have responsibilities. I know there was a big shift in the US when a dressage rider, Courtney King Dye, had a major head injury and people started wearing helmets more frequently after that. I'd always worn a helmet because I grew up in England and it's illegal to ride on the roads without a helmet. What about other sports as well where you might not wear a helmet, like you have a background in dance? How can you be proactive around mitigating actually getting injured in the first place?
There are many sports, unfortunately, where the use of traditional concussion safety gear is not applicable. For example, synchronized swimming. The CEO of USA Artistic Swimming said that 100% of all artistic swimmers will receive a concussion during their career, but they can't wear helmets, one, because they're swimming, and they also can't wear goggles because part of scoring is facial expressions, and having anything obscuring the eyes is a potential deduction. But at the same time, by instituting a policy like that, it is directly contributing to concussion risk. You're swimming blind in these tight formations. And similar with cheerleading, you're doing these high impact lifts and stunts, high impact tumbling. Like 1/3 of all injuries within cheerleading are concussions. And because they're also not allotted that kind of safety gear, they don't wear helmets and they can't because they're graded on their facial expressions. I think ways we can prevent, I think we just need to be educating. We need to provide resources, signs and symptoms of concussion. We need sports-specific concussion protocols that keep these nuances of the different sports in mind, because a concussion someone receives doing ballet might be very different than hitting your head on the uneven bars or the balance beam in gymnastics. It's just important keeping that in mind. And I also think it's important that athletes have access to medical care. We know that across all injuries, having access to medical care is like a key factor in how an athlete is going to recover. Female collegiate divers who 50% report receiving a concussion while in college, just within the 4 years of eligibility. They on average wait 12 hours before reporting any symptoms. And 12 hours with a brain injury, no matter how small, is major. And oftentimes a lot of these numbers get skewed because athletes aren't reporting because they don't know what to look for. So I think education, and I think having access to medical care on hand, having policies built with sports-specific nuance, but also still being based on the science, no matter how limited that is out there. And I think combating the idea that you always have to get up and try again is an equally important thing to challenge, because, like you were saying, it is normal to teach kids, like, okay, you fell, but you can get up and you can do it again. And that's great. We do want to build resilience in kids. That's a major reason why athletes participate in sports and why parents want their children to participate. But if you're saying every single time you have to get up right now and just get back on it and do it, we know that's putting athletes at risk.
Yes, I agree. And I think the statistics of the concussions are around almost 4 million concussions per year in sports. And there's still a 50% rate of those going unreported as well. So it really is a problem. I think the work you're doing is very important. I'm also very interested myself in the psilocybin treatment for traumatic brain injuries, because so far the results that have come out are very promising for treatment. And I know Northeastern University's done some great studies. A retired hockey player Daniel Carcillo, who's running a retreat center in Oregon, and he is pioneering some studies in concussions as well. And so I think just for people to know that there are promising avenues for treatment. And I know also in sports like dance as well, like the working on the proprioception, your balance, and finding your body in space after concussion is super important. And it seems like other sports could learn from the field of dance.
Yeah, it's so important that we keep an eye on all of the different emerging modalities and treatment options that are out there. Again, especially within the changing scientific landscape. As adults in the sporting environment, we want to ensure that we are staying educated and staying updated on what all's out there so we can best support athletes. Holistic care is so important, trying to support both like the mental health side of things and the physical side of things. For example, like the proprioception and spatial awareness.
I think it's helpful also to perhaps think about people who are working events, sporting events where concussions might happen, that they do either educate themselves or the governing bodies support education around trauma-informed processes of dealing with somebody who's had a head injury. I know myself, I got bucked off at regional championships and I was wearing a helmet, but the way that was handled, I didn't feel it was very supportive of my actual physical mind body, like coming back into awareness. The protocol felt more, it was around mitigating liability per se, rather than just giving me what I needed to orient myself back into time and space. So I'm wondering if that's something you think would also be important to establish trauma-informed protocols.
Of course. These injuries are traumatic. Yes, in the medical sense, but also for many athletes, they are directly traumatic, especially if you're sustaining them repeatedly or if you're sustaining them in a high stress environment like a regional championships. And it's very easy to want to mitigate kind of liability, but it really is up to the organizations to have these protocols on hand and address athletes appropriately and with sensitivity and empathy. We know in equestrian and across most of these sports, we know that concussions are high. These are not isolated incidents. So it's important that we know how to support people coming directly out of injury and people trying to return to play, because that's how we keep sports sustainable. It's how we encourage participation in the future. Even in traditionally male sports like soccer and lacrosse, female participants have higher concussion rates across the board. And it's because we're not providing adequate resources and facilities. The one that always comes to mind for me is like in the NCAA, men's lacrosse requires helmets, but female lacrosse doesn't. Even though they're the same sport, it's technically considered non-contact for girls, even though the game is the exact same. And we have seen the broader kind of context around concussions changing. We see even these kind of sporting organizations like the NFL and the National Hockey League and even FIFA trying to boost awareness and provide education. But we just have to make sure the needle is moving forward for everyone. There's a lot of misinformation out there about many health issues, and it's important that we are properly informed. The resources that we're getting need to be accurate.
Thank you so much for sharing all this information and research today. I think it's really valuable. And I hope that people will share this with others so we can build support and healthy, long careers or long participation in sports that we love.
Thank you so much for having me. As part of We Ride Together, we know that encouraging safe and healthy sports is critical for safety and to preserve the future of sports. We want to make sure athletes have all their bases covered. And I think it's so great that you are providing a platform to talk about these issues.
Thank you for tuning in today and investing your time with us. Feel free to share this episode with a friend, and we look forward to reconnecting with you in our next episode.